The porch floor was cold beneath her feet. She hadn't meant to wake, but her body had, as if something deep inside her had tugged her out of sleep, whispering, "Look." And so she stood there, half hidden behind the curtain, one hand pressed to the glass, watching the man she loved. Dig. Caius was down by the woodshed, shoulders hunched, hands moving with a rhythm that didn't belong to fixing or tending. He wasn't planting, he wasn't repairing, he was burying something, or unearthing it. The moonlight touched his face only in pieces, but what it showed didn't feel familiar. His expression was clenched, focus, not frantic, something worse, resigned. Rowena's breath stayed shallow in her throat. She didn't call out, she didn't move, she just watched. A shovel, a hole, a man too quiet for too long, and a name she hadn't spoken aloud because it hadn't been meant for her. Melis. He'd whispered it days ago when he thought she was asleep, tracing her skin with a tenderness that didn't feel like memory. It felt like mourning. Rowena had said nothing. She'd never asked who Melis was. But now, watching her husband in the dark, her silence held a different shape. He was hiding something. Something heavy. Welcome, friend. If you're new here, or even if you've walked with me before, thank you for being here. If stories like this grip you from the very first breath, take a second to like this video, comment below, and subscribe. We've only just begun, because some stories don't begin with a scream. They begin with silence. The kind that waits, the kind that listens. And Rowena Hartley had been listening for a long time, long before the hole, long before the name, before the photograph hidden in his forest log, before the night he held her like she was already gone. Her story doesn't begin in the moment she saw him digging. It begins in a quiet town tucked between the hills, where love looked like wildflowers on the kitchen table, and silence became the only language that told the truth. Blue Pine was the kind of town people didn't leave unless they had to. It sat quiet between folded hills, its streets lined with porches that creaked when you leaned too hard, and coffee that tasted like someone had cared enough to brew it slow. People knew each other. Smiles were real. Gossip moved gentle, not cruel, just curious. Rowena Hartley had lived there her whole life. The town knew her for her stillness, her soft voice, her way of noticing things no one else did, the way a robin always returned to the same branch each spring, or how the wind changed right before someone passed away. She was the kind of woman who remembered your dog's name, who kept flower seeds in her coat pocket, just in case the earth looked like it needed a little more color. She married Caius when she was 25. He was 5 years older, quiet like her, but with a look in his eye like he'd seen storms and decided he was done chasing them. They made a good match. 7 years, 2 children, a cabin wrapped in pine and laughter. That's what it looked like. But stillness has layers, and Rowena had learned to tell the difference between peace and pressure. At first, it was little things, a missed call, a changed expression, the way he stopped humming on the way in from work. Caius worked as a forest ranger. He'd always loved the woods, said they were the only place that ever made sense. That's where they met, the edge of a trail, his hands marked with dirt, hers full of lilies. She loved him completely. But now, she watched him sleep and wondered who he really dreamed about. There were no bruises, no shouting, no slammed doors, only silence. But silence can carry weight, and lately it had grown so heavy, Rowena felt it pressing on her chest while she made breakfast. She didn't ask him what was wrong. She never pressed, because sometimes asking breaks the spell, and she wasn't sure what spell they were under, the kind that protected, or the kind that warned. So she listened, and when she couldn't make sense of the silence anymore, she followed it, all the way to the glass window, all the way to the shovel. That night, standing by the window, Rowena didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She didn't reach for her phone or whisper his name. She simply stood, still and silent, the same way she had stood through so many small moments these past few months, waiting for something she couldn't name to rise from the quiet. Caius kept digging. One foot shifted. He paused, looked over his shoulder like he'd heard something. Rowena ducked out of view without a sound. Her heart pounded, not from fear exactly, but from recognition. A kind of knowing that didn't come from facts or proof. It came from memory, from energy, from being with someone long enough to sense what they weren't saying. He came back inside 20 minutes later. His hands smelled of soil and metal. He kissed her cheek and climbed into bed as if it were any other night. As if the weight beneath his fingernails meant nothing. She didn't speak, not then, because Rowena knew how to wait. She'd been waiting ever since he whispered Mela's. She didn't know the woman, never met her, never heard the name until it slipped out of his mouth in the dark, like something lost that had clawed its way back up through memory. But she'd seen the change in him ever since. The way he looked over his shoulder in the woods. The way he lingered near the windows at night, not watching her, but watching outside. Some things, Rowena believed, were better revealed in stillness. So she tucked away her questions, let her silences stretch wide enough to catch anything he might drop. The truth has a way of slipping through cracks when you stop chasing it, and she could feel it coming. Whatever it was, whatever had shaken him enough to make love to her like he was clinging to the edge of something, and dig holes in the middle of the night. It was coming, and when it arrived, she would be ready. Because Rowena Hartley may have been quiet, but she had never been blind. And silence remembers everything. There was a rhythm to Rowena's life, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind you could only notice if you were quiet long enough to feel it. Each morning began before the sun lifted its head over the ridge. She'd rise in the blue-gray light, wrap herself in her old wool cardigan, the one with the frayed cuff where Thayer had once chewed as a baby, and move through the cabin like breath. Her fingers would trail along the wooden counters, brushing flour from the surface. She'd start the kettle, feed the sourdough starter she kept on the windowsill, and check the wildflowers hanging upside down to dry above the stove. Sometimes she'd open the back door and just stand there, letting the cold air kiss her cheeks, letting the sound of the trees remind her she wasn't alone. The Hartley cabin sat a few miles beyond the edge of Blue Pine, near the western tree line of the National Forest, a place where phone signals went missing and stars came close enough to touch. Inside, the home breathed with history. The floorboards creaked, not from wear, but from memory. The shelves were lined with pressed leaves, old field guides, jars of herbs, and Eloise's watercolor paintings clipped to twine with clothespins. Rowena's favorite spot was the rocking chair by the front window. That's where she sat after breakfast most mornings, hands wrapped around a mug, Thayer curled, at her feet with a truck or a stick or whatever he'd decided was treasure that day. Eloise, already 6 going on 16, would chatter about her dreams, her books, the secret name she gave to the squirrel who visited the porch railing each afternoon. And Caius, when he wasn't working early patrol, would be out back stacking wood, checking fences, or filling the feeders. They didn't need much. The world they had was enough. That's what Rowena told herself. But even in peace, some things move quietly. A look held too long. A laugh that doesn't quite reach the eyes. A pause before answering. They don't shout. They settle. And lately, Rowena had started to notice those little things collecting like dust in corners. She hadn't said anything. Not yet. But the rhythm, it had changed. Slightly. Just enough. When Rowena met Caius, he barely spoke a full sentence. They were both 20-somethings volunteering for a conservation group. He was stacking trail markers. She was sketching wildflower types for the park brochure. The first time he really looked at her, really looked, he was kneeling in a patch of ferns, holding a baby bird in both hands, whispering that it had fallen too soon. He never raised his voice. Not in frustration, not in laughter. Caius Hartley was quiet in a way that didn't feel withdrawn. It felt deliberate, like he measured his words the same way he measured weather patterns or terrain, carefully, respectfully. Rowena had been drawn to that quiet. It matched something in her. Their love had been slow and certain. Like seeds planted under frost, it bloomed without noise or fanfare. She remembered the day he built the crib for Eloise with his own hands. He'd stayed up until 3 a.m, sanding the corners until they were soft as bread. Said it was because he didn't want the baby to get a splinter, and the way he kissed her forehead when she stitched his ranger patches to his new jacket, not out of duty, but because he wanted her hand to be the last touch before he walked into the woods each day. That kind of love doesn't leave loudly. It shifts. It fades beneath layers of life and routine. At first, Rowena thought the change in him was just fatigue, the kind that settled deep in the body during busy season when hikers got lost, tourists ignored warnings, and he'd come home dirt-smudged and achy. He'd fall asleep at the table sometimes. Miss dinner, skip story time. She never scolded him. She wrapped leftovers, kissed his shoulder, and turned off the porch light he always forgot. But lately, there were new things. Caius used to touch her waist absent-mindedly when they passed each other in the hallway. That stopped. He used to whisper, "I'll be back before you miss me." He stopped saying that too. His gaze lingered at the tree line more often than it lingered on her. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, she would wake and find him already awake, lying still beside her, staring into nothing. She never asked what he was thinking, because the part of her that loved him didn't want to know, and the part of her that feared the answer was starting to grow louder. Rowena had never been one to panic. She didn't rush. She didn't leap to conclusions. Life had taught her to wait, to sit still long enough for the real truth to show itself. But still, she noticed. She noticed when Caius started coming home just a little later than usual. The kind of late that didn't feel like time had simply slipped away. It felt intentional. He never offered excuses. Just walked in with mud on his boots and tension in his shoulders. He'd kiss the top of her head like a habit and head straight to the shower. Sometimes, Rowena would find damp pine needles in his coat pockets. Once, a torn scrap of paper folded so tightly she had to use a knife to open it. But it was blank, just torn and empty. There were moments she told herself not to overthink, not to invent stories in the spaces between facts. But her body knew something. She would feel it when his truck pulled up the gravel path, an unease settling at the base of her spine. She began checking the locks twice at night, not out of fear, out of instinct. And some mornings, after Caius left, she would walk the perimeter of the property with Thayer in one arm and a basket in the other, collecting herbs or gathering eggs. But her eyes were always scanning, her ears always tuned for something she couldn't name. The stillness had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tight, stretched, like a string pulled too far. And no matter how gently she moved through her days, something kept humming beneath it all. One evening, as the children colored at the table and the stew simmered, on the stove, Rowena stood at the sink, watching the sky lose its color. She saw Caius standing at the edge of the clearing just beyond the garden. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, back straight, hands in his jacket, looking into the woods like he was waiting for someone to walk out. She didn't call to him, didn't wave. She just dried her hands on her apron and turned away, because something told her, if she watched him too long, she'd see something she couldn't forget. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The shift didn't announce itself. It never does. It crept in gently, through the windows left open at night and the untouched corners of conversation. Caius started sleeping with his back to her. At first she thought it was fatigue. He'd come home, drop his keys into the old ceramic dish by the door, say something about patrols, then head straight to the bathroom. She'd hear the water run for longer than usual. Steam would creep under the door. When he emerged, he was always quieter, not angry, not sad, just missing, somehow, like a door halfway closed. Rowena stopped asking how his day was, not because she didn't care, but because he no longer answered like someone who wanted to be known. Instead, she studied his silence. She became fluent in the things he didn't say, the pause before he responded to the children, the way he avoided her eyes during dinner, the nights he went to check on the woodshed, long after the firewood had been stocked. Intimacy became a series of memories they were both pretending were still alive. And then, there were the nights he did reach for her. Those nights felt different. His hands still knew her body, but his mind was somewhere else. He would hold her tighter than he ever had, with a tenderness that trembled at the edges, as if trying to remember something that had begun to slip away. Rowena didn't pull back, but she watched him. She listened to the weight of his breathing, the tension in his grip, the way he whispered her name like it might be the last time. One night, after they'd been tangled in a quiet that didn't feel quite whole, he leaned his forehead against hers and exhaled, almost shaking. She didn't ask what was wrong, because asking might mean hearing something she wasn't ready for. Instead, she pressed her lips to his cheek, soft and still, and whispered, "I'm here." And though he nodded, she could feel it, the part of him that no longer was. It began with a scent, one Rowena didn't recognize. Not perfume exactly, something softer, worn leather warmed by sun, smoked cedar, something that didn't belong in their house, but clung faintly to the sleeves of Caius's jacket when he came home one evening. She buried her face in the fabric after hanging it near the door. Her breath caught. The smell was unfamiliar, intimate. It wasn't hers. That same night, she found one of Caius's park journals left open on the kitchen table. A page torn, a sketch half erased, not of a tree or a trail. A face. It was faint, done in graphite, but undeniably a woman. Long hair, tilted mouth, sadness in the eyes. He'd never drawn faces before, not even hers. She closed the journal and returned it to the bookshelf. Didn't mention it, but it stayed with her, as did the feeling that someone had walked past the cabin when she was alone that week. A soft crunch in the leaves while she and Thayer gathered herbs near the back trail. She turned quickly, but saw nothing. Later that afternoon, she found the gate to the garden slightly ajar. Rowena never left it open. The days stretched on, slow and tense. Every ordinary act seemed to carry an edge. She would pack the children's lunches and catch herself staring too long at the kitchen door, waiting for a knock that never came. Her dreams changed too. She began waking in the night, heart racing, with the clear image of eyes watching her from the tree line. No words, just watching. And always, she woke to find Caius lying still beside her, his back turned. When she touched his shoulder, he flinched. The warmth between them had begun to cool. Not completely, but enough for her to notice. Enough to wonder what he was thinking about when he turned away. And in the moments when he did reach for her, the desperation in his grip left her breathless, as if he was holding on too tightly, as if he was trying to prove something, or erase something, or forget someone. She didn't want to admit it, but there were times in those moments when she could feel it. He wasn't with her, not completely. And the worst part wasn't the distance. It was the presence of something else in the space between them. She just didn't know what or who it was. Not yet. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the pauses, the way Caius paused before answering Eloise when she asked what animals he'd seen, the way he paused before kissing Rowena goodnight, as though he had to remember who she was. There was love still, somewhere. She believed that. But it had started to feel like holding water in her hands. The tighter she tried to grasp it, the faster it slipped through. One evening, after putting Thayer to bed, she passed by Caius's coat and caught the scent again. It stopped her cold. Same smell. Warm and strange and close. It made her stomach turn. Not from disgust, from memory. Something deep. Something primal. She pressed her palm to her chest, trying to slow her breath. She didn't cry. She didn't confront. Instead, she walked outside and sat on the porch swing, staring into the trees until her tea went cold. When Caius joined her 20 minutes later, he didn't say a word, just sat beside her, elbows on his knees, head low. She studied him sideways, the shape of his hands, the way they rubbed together like he was trying to rid himself of something. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. His jaw clenched once. "Just tired," he said. She nodded, though she didn't believe him. "Has your heart ever whispered something your mind refused to hear? Something so soft, so persistent, it felt like a dream at first, until it kept repeating, until it became truth? If so, let me know in the comments." Rowena didn't tell him what her heart was whispering. She didn't say how loud it had gotten, how she'd started waking with tears on her face and didn't remember dreaming, how Thayer had said, "Mama, who was Daddy talking to?" after nap time last Thursday. She didn't say she'd found an old note in the bottom of the laundry basket, written in handwriting she didn't recognize. Just 2 words, "Tell her." She folded it, tucked it in the pocket of her apron, and said nothing. Because silence, she'd come to understand, isn't always absence. Sometimes silence is a shield. Sometimes it's a message. And sometimes it's a countdown. It was after the children had fallen asleep. The house was quiet except for the low ticking of the clock in the hallway and the occasional groan of old floorboards adjusting to the cold. Rowena stood in the doorway to the children's room for a long time after pulling their covers up. She watched Thayer's chest rise and fall, listened to Eloise's soft sighs. Peace still lived there, at least in them. She carried that comfort back with her as she walked down the hallway, past the bookshelf, past the window where the glass had fogged over, into the bedroom where Caius already lay beneath the blankets, one arm stretched across her side of the bed like he was waiting. He looked up at her with tired eyes. No words, just a slow breath as she slid in beside him. For the first time in weeks, he pulled her close without hesitation. His fingers traced the side of her neck, her collarbone. There was something tender in his touch, something aching. Rowena didn't resist. She let him hold her like he used to, like she was the only thing tethering him to the earth. They made love that night, quiet and slow, not like a celebration, not like routine, like memory. When it was over, he tucked her under his chin. His hand rested at the small of her back. Their legs tangled under the covers. He whispered her name once. Ro. She closed her eyes. Stay here, he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. Don't ever leave me again. She didn't understand. Again? She pulled back slightly to look at him, but his eyes were already shut. His breathing deepening. Then, barely audible, he breathed out one word. A name. Melis. Rowena went still, completely. Her hand remained on his chest, but her body turned to stone. She didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't even breathe for a moment. The name didn't belong to anyone she knew. Not a cousin, not a neighbor, not a colleague. It didn't belong in their bed. But it had come from his lips, with tenderness, with familiarity. She didn't move. She waited until his breathing evened out and deepened. Then, slowly, she turned away, not angrily, not tearfully, just turned, faced the wall, and listened to the silence stretch between them like a bridge no longer able to hold weight. She didn't ask him who Melis was. She didn't wake him, because in that moment, Rowena understood something without needing the facts. Whatever was broken had not just cracked, it had deepened over time. Grown roots. He had held another name inside his heart. And now, it had found its way to the surface. The next morning, Rowena moved through her routine like always. She poured oats into the pot, measured cinnamon without spilling. Thayer sat at the table with a spoon in each hand. Eloise was drawing on the back of a paper bag with a blue marker she'd found in the couch cushions. Caius came into the kitchen wearing his green flannel shirt, the one she used to steal when folding laundry just to breathe him in. He kissed her on the cheek. His lips lingered a little too long. Sleep okay? He asked, pouring coffee. Rowena nodded. Fine. She said it evenly. Steady. He didn't look at her long. Just stirred his mug slowly, staring out the window toward the trees. She watched him. Not like before, not with concern, not with longing. She watched him the way one watches a trail for signs. Every glance, every motion. He sat across from her at breakfast, smiled at the children, complimented Eloise's drawing. But something was off. Not new, known now. It was like hearing a sound you've ignored for days, and suddenly realizing it had been trying to warn you all along. That name, Melis. Rowena didn't repeat it in her mind. She didn't have to. It was already carved into the part of her that remembered everything quietly. He had spoken it the way a person might speak to someone who was missing, someone whose absence still echoed. She thought back to the past few weeks, the scent on his coat, the sketch, the open gate, the shadows she'd felt just beyond the tree line. Had this woman come back? Was she ever truly gone? Rowena didn't know, but she knew the way Caius's shoulders hunched when he was lying. She knew the slight catch in his throat when Eloise asked questions that landed too close to home. She knew the weight of a man trying to hide something without breaking completely. And so she said nothing. She didn't accuse. She didn't cry. She listened. She moved through the day with practiced ease, washed the dishes, read to Thayer, hung a sheet to dry in the autumn wind. But beneath her stillness, everything had changed. She was no longer reaching for answers. She was waiting for them to reveal themselves. And in the meantime, she began to write. In her journal, the one hidden beneath the floorboard of the linen closet, she wrote down the name. She wrote the date, the time, the temperature in the room, the sound of the wind outside. Because Rowena Hartley knew what it meant to remember carefully, and she had the sinking feeling that she might need these memories soon, not for herself but for someone else. Someone who might ask one day, "What did you know? And when did you begin to know it?" The discovery wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with music or trembling hands. It came while cleaning. A Tuesday morning, late October. Thayer was down for a nap. Eloise was coloring in the living room, and Rowena had decided to dust the top shelf of the bookcase, the one where Caius kept his ranger logs. She had dusted those books dozens of times, But this time, one had shifted when she touched it. It fell open. The spine cracked a little, and a thin, worn piece of paper fluttered loose, gliding to the floor like a feather. Rowena froze. Then, slowly, she knelt and picked it up. It was a photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. The image had faded over time, but the face was still clear. A woman, tall, slender, dark hair falling past her shoulders, eyes set deep, with something unreadable in them, something fierce and fragile all at once. Her expression was unsmiling, but not cold. There was a story behind those eyes. And it wasn't Rowena's. The photo had no border, no frame, no year printed at the bottom. But someone had written on the back in pen, now smudged with age. Malis, August 2011. Rowena sat down, right there on the floor. She stared at the name, the same one Caius had whispered weeks ago. And now, a face, a real woman, not imagined, not dreamed. She didn't know what she expected Malis to look like. But it wasn't this. This wasn't a woman who disappeared without leaving pieces behind. This was a woman who lingered. And now, she was here, between the pages of her husband's past. Rowena's first reaction wasn't rage. It wasn't heartbreak. It was confusion. Who was she to him? What did she mean in 2011? What does she mean now? Had he forgotten the photo? Or left it there deliberately, like some part of him wanted to be caught? Rowena turned the photo over again and looked into Malis's eyes. There was something familiar in them, not in the shape or color, but in the presence. The way the woman stared into the lens, unflinching. The way she took up space even in black and white. Rowena felt small holding it. And then, for just a moment, she felt foolish. Foolish for loving a man whose past she never fully knew. Foolish for trusting the quiet between them was just exhaustion and not distance. Foolish for never asking. But that moment passed. She folded the photo carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. Later that day, she pressed it between the pages of her journal and wrote down everything. The date, the time, where she found it, what it looked like. She did not ask Caius about it. She did not leave it where it was, because Rowena Hartley was done waiting for things to explain themselves. She wasn't confronting. She was collecting. Thank you, Emmanuel. Here's part 2 of section 5. The photograph in the forest log approx. 800 to 850 words, completing the section. This portion focuses on the aftermath of discovery, Rowena's internal unraveling without outward confrontation, her growing emotional conflict, and her quiet preparation for what she may have to face. The third CTA is placed naturally at the point of emotional weight and reflection. Section 5, the photograph in the forest log. Part 2, approx. 850 words. That night, Rowena couldn't sleep. Not because Caius was different. He wasn't. He brushed his teeth, changed into his worn sleep shirt, kissed her shoulder before slipping beneath the covers. But now, she was different. He reached for her, just lightly. The way he used to when their babies were new and sleep was a prize neither of them could keep. But she stayed still, her hand beneath the pillow pressed against the hidden corner of her journal, where the photo now lived between pages she hadn't meant to revisit. She stared at the ceiling, her breath soft and even, pretending to drift while her mind ran in a circle. Malis. She knew the name now. She knew the face. What she didn't know was the place. Where did she exist? In time, in memory, in his heart? Was she a chapter long closed, or a door cracked open, waiting? And if Malis had been important, if she had meant something, why hadn't Caius ever spoken of her? Why keep her photograph hidden in a field log, tucked away like a fossil no one was meant to uncover? Unless it wasn't forgotten. Unless it had been visited. Recently, Rowena turned onto her side, facing away from him. She thought of all the times he'd been distant lately. The mornings he left early, the evenings he came home late. The way his voice dipped when speaking certain words. The hesitation before his fingers found hers. She thought of the scent. The open gate. The sketch. It was all adding up to something. Something she hadn't asked for. Something she hadn't deserved. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to summon her strength. Not to cry, but to stay composed. She couldn't afford to crumble. Not yet. Have you ever discovered something you wish you hadn't? Something that made your heart beat slower and louder at the same time? Something that changed everything? Without saying a word? If you have liked this video, share it with someone who might understand, and tell your story in the comments. Rowena didn't tell hers, not out loud, but she carried it now, tucked inside her, the way a seed carries a whole forest. She began noticing more. The look in Caius's eyes when she mentioned old photos. The subtle flicker that passed over his face when Eloise asked where they went on their first date. The long pause before he answered. She didn't push, didn't corner, didn't accuse, but her awareness sharpened. She watched how he stirred his tea, how often he stepped out to check the shed, how many minutes he lingered between stepping onto the porch and starting the truck. She wasn't paranoid. She was precise. She cataloged things now, quietly. Each memory, each sentence, each shift in energy. And each night she wrote it all down, in the journal he didn't know, existed, folded in the lining of her winter coat in the hallway closet. She wasn't preparing for confrontation. She was preparing for clarity, because if Melis had returned, in memory or in person, Rowena needed to know how close she was willing to let her come, and how far Caius might go to keep the past buried. It was just after midnight when Rowena opened her eyes. There was no sound, no dream that shook her awake, just that same pull, that deep whisper her body had learned to trust. She lay still for a moment, listening. Caius wasn't beside her. The space he usually occupied was empty, the blanket still warm. She sat up slowly, not turning on the lamp. Not yet. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the trees outside had fallen still, as if holding their breath. Rowena slipped out of bed, pulled her cardigan from the hook, and padded barefoot across the wooden floor. She passed the children's room. Both slept peacefully. She reached the kitchen and paused near the back window. The curtain was already drawn open. Outside, the woods stood dense and unmoving. The sky above was pale with moonlight, full and cold. That's when she saw him. Caius, standing near the edge of the shed, half-shadowed, shovel in hand. Her breath caught, not because he was there, but because of what he was doing. He was digging, not with the slow deliberation of a gardener, not with the ease of someone moving soil for planting. He was focused, intense, quiet. The hole wasn't new. She could tell. He was deep in it now, clearing something out, or putting something in. Rowena stepped back from the window and pressed her back to the wall. She didn't panic, but her heartbeat was sharp in her ears. Her mind raced, thinking of the photograph, the name, the scent, the sketch, the note, all of it stacking, piece after piece. She moved carefully to the back door, unlocked it with practiced silence, and stepped onto the porch. The cold met her immediately. The boards creaked faintly beneath her weight. She stopped, waiting to see if he noticed. He didn't. She stepped down, one stair at a time, her bare feet pressed into the chilled wood. She moved across the yard like a shadow herself, not blinking. She crouched behind the woodpile, watched him. His breath was visible in the night air. His sleeves pushed up to the elbows. His hands worked without pause. Rowena's eyes scanned the ground near him. A small pile sat beside the hole. Rocks, dirt, and something else. Metal. A box. Old. Rusted. Not big enough for something living, but heavy enough to matter. She squinted. It looked like an ammunition case, the kind soldiers kept during deployment. Caius didn't open it. He placed it gently beside the pit and kept digging. The shovel hit something with a dull thud. He froze, stood still for several seconds, hands on the handle. Rowena's stomach tightened. She didn't know what he'd hit. But she knew this wasn't firewood. This wasn't part of any project. This was personal, buried, hidden. Caius leaned down, brushed something aside, then sat back on his heels. He covered his face with both hands. Rowena could see his shoulders shake. Once, maybe twice. She waited. He didn't look toward the house, didn't speak. He just sat there, alone in the dark, surrounded by loose earth and secrets. And then, as if nothing had happened, he stood, lifted the box, set it inside the hole, and began covering it again. Rowena waited until the final scrape of the shovel, until the sound of Caius's boots faded across the gravel, until the door creaked open and clicked closed. She stayed hidden for another minute, maybe two, just long enough for the chill to reach her bones. Only then did she rise, barefoot, fingers trembling against her sleeves. She didn't go to the hole. She didn't uncover the box. Not yet. Instead, she turned back toward the house, one step at a time, letting the dark wrap around her like a second skin. The porch light flickered as she reached for the knob. She hadn't turned it on. Neither had he. Inside, the house felt warmer than before, but it didn't comfort her. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the floor for a long time. Listening, she could hear him. Moving slowly in the bathroom, water running. She imagined him washing his hands, his arms, his face, washing the night off of him. Rowena walked to the bedroom and stood in the doorway. He was there, sitting on the edge of the bed in a clean shirt, rubbing his eyes. "You okay?" he asked, voice hoarse. She nodded. "I couldn't sleep." He didn't press, didn't explain where he'd been. He just patted the mattress beside him. "Come lie down. You're freezing." She slid beneath the blanket, back to him. He curled around her instinctively, arm draped over her waist. To someone watching, it might have looked like love, but Rowena knew better. It was something else, something quieter. She lay there with her eyes open, staring into the dark, her breath shallow, measured. Caius's hand moved gently against her hip, as if reassuring himself she was still there, still his, still unaware. But she wasn't. She had seen too much, and she hadn't said a word. That was her power now. Not what she asked, but what she didn't. Not what she knew, but what she was waiting to learn. Sleep didn't come, not for hours. When it did, it was light and restless. She woke before the sun, made coffee, packed the children's lunches, watered the herbs, all while her mind whispered the same question again and again. What's in that box? And why bury it now? The timing didn't feel random. The photograph, the tension, the name. Now this. She didn't believe in coincidence anymore. Rowena didn't check the shed that day. She didn't walk near it, but her eyes followed Caius whenever he moved. She noted the way he lingered at the window, how his shoulders dropped when he thought no one was watching. Something inside him had cracked open, and something inside her had sharpened. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was ready. She was waiting. The next evening passed in slow motion. Dinner was quiet. Rowena made stew, his favorite, not as an offering, but as a way to keep everything normal. The scent of rosemary filled the kitchen, mixing with the low murmur of Eloise humming to herself as she drew beside her bowl. Thayer sat in his booster seat, clapping his spoon against the edge of the table like a soft drumbeat. Caius was present. Physically, he answered when spoken to. He smiled when Thayer made a mess. He complimented the food, but he didn't eat much. His spoon stayed mostly still. His hands fidgeted. He kept glancing toward the window, not outside exactly, but toward the dark. After the children went to bed, Rowena began to clean. Caius didn't help. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, gaze low. "You want tea?" she asked without looking up. "No." She rinsed the ladle, dried her hands, turned to him. He was still standing there, just watching her like he was trying to find something in her expression, something buried. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her chest tightened. "Okay." He didn't move, didn't come closer. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe like his legs wouldn't hold him upright. "I should have told you a long time ago," he said. "I just didn't know how." Rowena didn't speak. She waited. He looked down, rubbing his thumb along his wrist like he was wiping something away. "Before I met you," he said, "I was with someone. For a long time. 5 years." Rowena didn't flinch. "She was different," he continued. "Hard to explain. Wild in a way. Unpredictable. She'd go from laughter to silence in seconds. I never knew which version of her I'd get. But she had this way of pulling me in." Rowena's jaw stayed still. "I met her in Oregon," he went on. "Her name was—" He paused. "Melis." There it was. Spoken aloud. Not whispered in sleep. Not hidden in ink. Spoken. She was intense, Caius said. She said things she didn't mean. Did things she regretted. But when it was good between us, it was blinding. I felt like I was alive in a way I hadn't been before. He smiled for a second, but it didn't last. We fought a lot. Too much. She left once for 2 months, came back with a tattoo and a story I never believed. He looked up at Rowena then. She met his eyes, said nothing. I moved out first, he said. Told her I needed space. She said if I left, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. That if I ever loved anyone else, she'd ruin it. Rowena's heart was steady, but her fingers curled around the edge of the sink. She disappeared not long after that, Caius said. Told people she was going back to Vermont, but she never made it. No one ever heard from her again. Her family searched, called me, even filed a report. But they couldn't find her. Rowena didn't move. I told the police we'd fought, that she was upset, but I didn't know where she went. He stepped into the kitchen now, slow. She never came back, he said. Not until 2 weeks ago. Rowena's breath caught, just once. She showed up at the park, Caius said. Out of nowhere. Said she'd followed the trails, that she knew where I worked, that she'd been watching for months. He pulled out a chair and sat down. She looked different, thinner. Her hair was shorter. She seemed tired, but still sharp, still intent. She said she didn't care that I had a family, that she'd take back what was hers. Rowena wanted to speak, ask, but the words wouldn't form. I told her to leave. I told her I had a wife, 2 kids, that she needed to let go. Caius wiped his hands on his jeans. She wouldn't. She showed up again the next day, and the next. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to scare you. I thought, maybe if I stayed calm she'd go away. Rowena shook her head slightly, not in disbelief, in dread. She left a letter under my truck wiper last week, he said. Said she wasn't going to disappear again, that if she did, it would be my fault. His voice cracked. I haven't seen her since. Not a call, not a note, nothing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes glossy. I don't know where she is now. I swear. Rowena sat down across from him, slowly, her hands folded in her lap, her posture still. She stared at him, not like someone looking for answers, but like someone finally seeing what had always been there. His eyes searched hers, not for forgiveness, not yet, for safety, for understanding, but she didn't offer either, not immediately. I didn't hurt her, he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't touch her. I didn't threaten her. Rowena stayed quiet. I just wanted her to leave, he said. That's all. The silence in the room changed. Not louder, not colder, fuller. Caius leaned back in the chair, ran a hand over his face. I didn't bury anything, he added, his voice breaking. Not a body, not anything like that. Rowena flinched internally, not at his denial, at the fact that he had to say it. He closed his eyes. I thought she might be bluffing, playing a game again. But this time it felt different. He swallowed. She looked done, like something in her had gone out. His voice was unraveling now. I don't know if she's dead, Ro, I swear to you. But if she is... He stopped. If she is, I didn't cause it. Rowena sat in the silence that followed. She could hear the hum of the fridge, the creak of the hallway, and her own pulse, steady, tight. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. She'd imagined this moment 100 different ways. None of them looked like this. The truth, or whatever version of it Caius had just spoken, didn't come with relief. It came with weight, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he hadn't. She rose from the chair without a word, walked to the window, pulled the curtain back. The trees stood still in the night, their shadows long, watching. Why didn't you tell me the first time you saw her? She asked quietly. Caius didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick. Because I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me now. Rowena felt her throat tighten. She turned back to him. And how am I looking at you? Like I'm someone you don't know anymore. She didn't argue, didn't reassure him. Because in that moment, she wasn't sure who she was looking at. This man, her husband, the father of her children, had once loved a woman who had vanished into thin air, only to reappear at the edge of their life like smoke. And now, he was sitting here, broken open, not asking for forgiveness, not begging, just telling. She walked to the sink and poured herself a glass of water. Her hand shook slightly as she drank. When she turned around, Caius was still sitting there, hunched, smaller than he'd ever looked. What was in the box? She asked. His head lifted slowly. She met his eyes. Last night, she said, steady. By the shed, his lips parted. You saw? She nodded once. He didn't try to deny it. Letters, he said. Old ones, from her. Stuff I kept. I meant to throw them away years ago, but I didn't. I thought if I burned them, it would be too final." Rowena waited. He continued. "I buried them. Not because of guilt. Because I wanted it to be over. I didn't want them in our house anymore. Didn't want her words living in our walls." Her eyes stayed on him, unreadable. "You should have told me," she said. "I know." There was nothing more to say. Not that night. He stood, slowly, and moved toward her. Stopped a foot away. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said. "But I swear, I didn't hurt her. I never would." Rowena looked at him, tired, hollow, unsure. She wasn't ready to decide what she believed. Not yet. She walked past him, down the hallway, into their bedroom. Closed the door behind her. Didn't lock it, but didn't open it again either. She sat at the edge of the bed, the moonlight creeping across the floorboards like an old friend. What do you do when someone you love tells you something that rearranges the shape of your life? Pause for a moment. What would you do if someone you loved confessed something like this? Tell me below. Rowena lay down on the side of the bed that still held his shape and stared at the ceiling, not searching for answers, just listening to the quiet, to her breath, to the part of herself that wasn't afraid, only tired. Sleep didn't come easy that night, but neither did panic. Just the slow weight of truth, or the version of it she'd been handed. Rowena waited 3 days. 3 days of silence. Caius moved through the house like a man waiting for a verdict. He didn't ask if she believed him. He didn't push for closeness. He existed beside her, cautious, quiet, watching for signs. The children didn't notice the change. They still laughed during breakfast, begged for bedtime stories, argued over crayons. But Rowena noticed everything. The way Caius's eyes followed her across a room. The extra wood he stacked near the shed, like a guardrail. The fact that he didn't return to the place he'd buried the box, at least not when she could see. On the 4th night, she waited until he fell asleep. She watched his breathing slow, watched the tension fall from his shoulders. Then she rose, dressed in layers, boots, jacket, gloves. She took the flashlight from the drawer near the back door, the one Caius always kept charged. Outside, the air was sharp, not cold enough for frost, but cold enough to numb her fingertips. The woods stood still, and the ground remembered the last disturbance. Rowena walked toward the shed slowly, careful not to step on any branches that might snap. When she reached the spot, she paused. The dirt was still loose, not freshly turned, but not fully settled either. She knelt beside it, let her gloved hand skim the surface, and then she began to dig. It didn't take long. The soil gave way without resistance, and soon her fingers hit metal. She pushed the dirt aside and lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked, covered in rust, the clasp stiff. She sat back on her heels, placed it in her lap, and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some folded carefully, others torn at the edges. Some were burned, not fully, but enough to show the attempt. She pulled one out at random. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, the ink smudged. "You said I was too much, but you liked the way I burned." She put it aside, opened another. "If you leave, I'll find you." "You know I will. You're not the only one who knows the woods." Rowena read each letter slowly, as if decoding a language no one else was meant to see. Some were filled with longing, others with rage. Some sounded like a woman desperate to be loved. Others read like warnings. And one, near the bottom, was different. It was written on heavier paper, the ink more deliberate. It wasn't addressed to Caius. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was a confession. "If you ever find this, it means I've done what I promised. I'd rather vanish than watch you give what was mine to someone else. If they call it missing, let them. I chose this. I wanted to go before I turned into something I couldn't return from." Rowena held the page for a long time. The flashlight beam flickered slightly, casting shadows that moved across the dirt. She wasn't sure what to feel. Relief? Horror? Malis hadn't been taken. She'd chosen to disappear. But she hadn't just walked away. She'd left behind a storm. A trail of words that clung to the walls of their home, their marriage, their family. Rowena sat there for a while, the letter in her lap, the wind brushing past her cheek. The truth didn't come with answers. It came with questions she hadn't prepared for. Had Caius known she'd planned this? Had he pushed her toward it? Had he tried to stop her? Or had he watched her vanish and simply Let her go. She folded the letter and placed it back in the box, covered it with the others, and then she closed the lid. She didn't carry it back to the house. She placed it in the hole and buried it again. But this time she pressed the dirt down with both hands, smoothed it carefully. When she was done, she stood and walked back inside without looking over her shoulder. Back inside the house, Rowena didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching the outlines of her life stretch quietly around her. Caius stirred once, reached for her in the dark. She let his hand rest against her thigh, but she didn't move. Her breath was shallow, her mind loud. She thought of Melis's handwriting, the slant, the sharpness of it. She thought of the words, "I chose this." Had she really? Or had something or someone made her believe that vanishing was the only path left? When morning came, the sun filtered softly through the blinds. The children were already up, padding through the hallway in socks and laughter. Rowena stood, pulled on her sweater, and headed toward the kitchen like it was any other day. Caius was there. He looked up quickly. His eyes searched her face for answers. But she gave him none. She poured orange juice, set cereal on the table, kissed Thayer's head, and said nothing. Caius didn't ask, not a single question. That night, he touched her again, not with urgency, but with apology. There was no pleading in his breath, no desperation in his hands, just softness, a kind of aching stillness. Rowena let him hold her, let him press his forehead to hers, let his mouth wander across her shoulder like someone asking forgiveness without speaking the word. She didn't resist, but her eyes never closed. The next day, she walked to the shed again, not to dig, just to be near it. She stood by the spot where the letters now lay beneath the earth. Then she turned away and gathered wildflower seeds from her pocket. She pressed them into the soil, one by one. No fanfare, just quiet movements. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at the spot. It didn't look like a grave. It looked like possibility, a place where something pain laid down, and something tender might grow in its place. But she knew better than to trust appearances. That night she wrote in her journal, not details, just one line. I found her voice. It's louder than his. Weeks passed. The tension in the house softened. Caius smiled more, played longer with the children, held Rowena closer when they sat on the porch. Sometimes he'd pause mid-laugh, like he'd remembered something awful, but he never said her name again. And Rowena never asked. She didn't need him to confess a second time. She had all the truth she could carry. And maybe some truths don't need confrontation. Maybe some ghosts don't want revenge. Maybe they just want to be left where they were buried. Rowena carried that thought often. It settled into her bones like winter light, cool and constant. She kept the journal hidden deep in her drawer. She never looked at the letters again. But she never forgot them either, because forgetting would be a kind of betrayal, and she was done pretending, not outwardly, not in ways Caius could name, but inwardly. She was awake. Forever. There were no more surprises in the weeks that followed, no more strange phone calls, no more late walks into the woods, no more names spoken in the dark that didn't belong to her. But Rowena didn't relax. She adapted. Each day began the same, soft humming in the kitchen, the scent of coffee, the small scuffles of socks on wood as Eloise and Thayer raced to their places at the table. Caius would walk in moments later, the way he always did, slightly behind the noise, as if waiting for permission to enter the life he had nearly fractured. He kissed her cheek every morning now. He lingered in her gaze. He asked about her garden, about the children, about her dreams, if she remembered them. She answered him. She even smiled. But beneath every glance, every gentle exchange, Rowena held her breath. Not out of fear anymore, but because she understood the cost of speaking when silence gave her power. It wasn't forgiveness she had offered him. It wasn't absolution. It was preservation, for the children, for her own sanity, and perhaps for love, a version of it, aged by time and trimmed by sorrow. She no longer asked questions she didn't want the answers to, but she noticed everything. Still, like how Caius no longer left the house after dusk, or how he avoided the trail behind the shed, even when the fence needed mending, or the way he sometimes sat on the porch long after the children were asleep, staring toward the tree line as if waiting for something. Or someone. Rowena would watch him from the kitchen window, hands damp from washing dishes, wondering what haunted him in those moments. She never interrupted, but she always left the porch light on. Caius never returned to the spot where she'd planted wildflowers. He never brought it up. Rowena did not offer him the truth of what she'd found there. That was hers, entirely, and because of that, she owned something more powerful than confrontation could ever give her. The children, blissfully unaware, grew like weeds, curious, bright, loud in the most beautiful ways. Eloise began writing stories in a notebook she carried everywhere, words blooming in the margins like flowers that refused to be contained. Thayer followed his mother everywhere still, his hand always searching for hers like he needed its anchor. Some nights Rowena would watch her children sleep and feel the ache of what might have been lost. She knew now, had she asked the wrong question at the wrong time, had she broken the surface too soon, their family would have cracked open entirely. She would have left, or he would have, and maybe that would have been justified. But something inside her had chosen differently. Not out of weakness, out of something else. Perhaps it was endurance. Perhaps it was control. Perhaps it was love, stripped down to its most difficult form. The kind that stays, not because it should, but because it chooses to. Rowena never told another soul about the letters. Not even years later, when Eloise turned 16 and asked her what love was supposed to feel like. Rowena had simply said, "It's complicated, and that's okay." But in her journal, now worn and faded, she had written, "Love is knowing the whole story and deciding which parts deserve your voice." The porch became their place. She and Caius would sit out there most evenings now, wrapped in an old blanket, the children already dreaming inside. They rarely talked about anything deep. They didn't need to. Sometimes the greatest peace came from sharing space with someone who no longer required explanation, and sometimes Rowena would find herself leaning her head against his shoulder, letting the warmth of his silence carry her further than any promise ever could. They didn't make new vows. They made dinner. They fixed fences. They watched their children grow. And in that simplicity, there was something profound, not perfect, but lasting. If this story struck a chord, hit the like button and share it with someone who would understand. The journal had a linen cover and soft spine, worn where time had touched it gently. It wasn't meant for publication. It wasn't meant for friends. It was meant for one person only. Rowena had begun writing it the day Eloise turned 13, not because there was a crisis or a question, but because her daughter had started to look at the world differently. There was a quiet storm in her eyes, a hunger to understand things that didn't have names. So Rowena wrote, not as a warning, not even as a lesson, but as a truth, a long one that had taken her years to shape into something soft enough to pass down. She wrote at night. She wrote while the kettle boiled. She wrote when silence pressed too tightly against the walls. And now, nearly 2 decades after the night she watched her husband dig beneath a pale moon, she handed the journal to Eloise with a smile that held 1,000 locked doors. "Not now," she said, "but one day, when you're asking questions you don't want answers to, open this." And Eloise, always respectful, nodded. She tucked it into her bookshelf between a poetry collection and an old pressed flower album. And for years, she left it untouched. Inside the first page, Rowena had written in her calm, looping script, "You won't find fairy tales here. You'll find choices. And love, not the kind you read in novels. The kind that burns quietly and never asks to be seen. The kind that survives storms by standing still." Rowena never mentioned Caius by name until much later in the pages. She didn't need to. This wasn't a retelling of betrayal. It wasn't revenge. It was reflection. It was memory shaped into something her daughter could walk through without fear. She began with the wildflowers, how she'd once believed that planting something was an act of trust, that if you buried a seed and waited, what came up would always be beautiful. Until she learned, some things buried grow twisted, not because the seed was wrong, but because the soil was never ready. Still, she loved the garden. Still, she stayed. Even as the earth around her whispered of old names and broken promises, she wrote, "You can stay, even when something in you wants to run. That doesn't make you weak. Sometimes staying is the braver thing." Some pages in the journal were wrinkled at the corners, watermarked from the nights Rowena cried softly while writing. Not all tears came from pain. Some were made of something gentler, the kind that fall when you realize you're still here, still waking, still choosing. "There's something I need you to understand," she wrote. "Love, real love, it doesn't always come wrapped in comfort. Sometimes it walks in carrying old wounds, quiet lies, and fears it doesn't know how to name. And still, you open the door." She told Eloise how fear was not always loud. Sometimes fear sat at the table and passed the salt. Sometimes it climbed into bed next to you, wearing the same face you kissed goodnight. Sometimes it apologized before it ever confessed. Rowena had lived in that kind of fear, but she never let it steal her softness. She didn't raise her voice. She raised her awareness. She listened when no one was talking. She noticed what changed, not just the tone, but the pauses between words. The nights that grew longer without explanation, and when the truth came, it didn't shout. It slipped in through the cracks. "There is strength in silence," she wrote. "Not the kind that avoids or denies, but the kind that watches, that waits, that walks into the dark. Not to escape, but to see what's really there." She described the letters, the box, the ache, the guilt that wasn't hers, but settled into her ribs like it belonged there. She didn't blame Caius, not fully, but she didn't excuse him either. "And that too," she wrote. "You're allowed to forgive someone and still never forget what they were capable of." Rowena's handwriting became steadier toward the end, as if her heart had finally settled into the truth she'd been circling all those years. She spoke of mornings, of Eloise at the window with a book too big for her hands, of Thayer chasing shadows between tree trunks, of Caius boiling coffee in silence, his eyes softer but still carrying weight. "You will meet people who carry invisible storms. Love does not require you to become their shelter. But if you choose to stay, let it be a decision you make with open eyes and a heart that knows its own strength." She explained that life with Caius didn't turn into a perfect ending. There were good years. There were quiet years. There were days she felt safe and others when she slept with questions tucked beneath her pillow. And still, she stayed. Not because she was trapped, but because over time she saw the small ways he tried to rebuild, not loudly, but in the way. He held their children's hands a little longer, listened more closely, forgot himself less often. Rowena didn't frame their story as a warning. She framed it as a mirror. One day you may find yourself loving someone who has been fractured by something they never told you. If you choose to walk with them, walk with your eyes open. And remember, staying is not surrender. It is an act of courage, so long as you stay because you choose to, not because you've forgotten how to leave. She closed the journal with a final page, no longer addressed to my daughter, but simply signed, "From a woman who stayed and still grew wildflowers anyway." And then, in ink darker than the rest, she wrote, "Love is not always loud. Sometimes it's the hand you hold in silence. Sometimes it's the question you never ask, because you already know the answer and you choose to love anyway."